the other logos, or the reason of cunning, on the intellectual history of the indirect. The fact that a profoundly radical climate change occurred in the Greek intellectual domain, and among the Athenians in particular, as the 5th century BCE ended and the 4th began, is a well-known, if seldom appreciated, part of old European cultural history. It is usually associated with the negative effects of the Peloponnesian War, that 30-year ancient conflict that led to Athens' ruin and the loss of its hegemony over the eastern Mediterranean. After the Spartan invasion of 404, the infamous dictatorship of the 30 tyrants was established, and provoked a democratic counter-movement, whose far-reaching consequences included the indictment brought against Socrates in 399, when he was charged with atheism and corrupting the youth. Part 1. The normalization of the Logos. There is a commonplace, as legitimate as it is cliched, according to which Socrates' death opened a new chapter in the history of ideas. The discipline of philosophy established by Plato, influenced by Ionic and Pythagorean models, adopted the passion of the sage as its foundational myth. It thus introduced an unprecedented, almost religious seriousness into the quarrels of the learned and of intellectuals. Above all, the story of Socrates' death dramatically widens the gap between the few who were engaged in obtaining real knowledge for themselves, or were at least striving for it, and the ignorant many. At the same time, Plato delegitimized the poetic expression of the divine, which had thrived in the context of Dionysian festivals, and reclaimed the endeavour to speak truly of God and the divine for the school he founded on the fringes of the city, whose name is supposed to have been taken from an otherwise unknown local hero by the name of Academos. The academization of the Logos was not merely supposed to harm the reputation of poets, whom Plato began to ironically refer to as theologoi, implying that they spoke of God without really knowing anything about him. It was also meant to thoroughly delegitimize the eristic discourse that was quite prevalent among Greek men at the time, and indeed to completely delegitimize all forms of the instrumental or strategic use of reason, insofar as the latter involved a claim to public legitimacy. Plato's polemic against the sophistic movement is supposedly a stable factor in the old European culture of rationality. But there was actually a break here with the older custom of agonal, urban speech, and historians can justifiably claim that Platonism, with its odd pathos for the afterlife, its esprit de sérieux, and its latent Egyptianism, remained a foreign body within Greek culture, and only found its proper milieu after the rise of Christianity. The phenomenon of Plato may well have represented an idealistic exception in its time. However, we are here concerned with the development of a new discursive rule, which stipulates that the conventional techniques for being right in the heuristic of opinions, while conversing with others in search of truth and wisdom, with those who will henceforth be called philosophoi, have been rendered inoperative. If the Platonic invention of philosophy ended up having far-reaching consequences, this was less because it established a dominant school, and more because it introduced a logical practice through which a new type of authority gains ground. The oft-cited Socratic art of dialogue, the dialectic, was not essentially mere eristic, not an art of disputation, lasting more than 2,000 years until Schopenhauer again evoked the submerged discipline in his short text, The Art of Being Right, but rather understood itself as a process for disarming the participants in a discussion and leading them out of fruitless strife. The goal of this process was to estrange the holders of an opinion from the ideas they also associated with it, so that they henceforth received their beliefs directly from, quote-unquote, truth itself. Thus, the Platonic caesura should not merely be interpreted as an alien idealism that has pervasively spread throughout a pragmatically minded environment. Rather, it must be attributed to a much wider development, which could be characterized as the establishment of a new logical norm. This is closely associated with two cultural innovations that led to Greece's special place in the history of rational cultures. On the one hand, we have the emergence of Greek writing, which was connected to the formation of memory capacity for coded knowledge, and eo ipso connected to an increase of claims to lasting knowledge. On the other hand, we have the discovery of rigorous sciences, particularly in the form of mathematics. It may well be that the academy, which was nominally devoted to paideia, the education of youth, was initially perceived as a foreign body within the framework of the old Athenian institutions. At this time, in the agora, the theatre, and the stadium, the city possessed three institutions where citizens could practice stepping out into the light of the public sphere. Hannah Arendt very fittingly called such places, the agora in particular, spaces of appearance, Erscheinungsräume, for ambitions typical of the polis. Its initial strangeness soon yielded to solid habitualization. This can be seen from the remarkable fact that the Academy pursued its mission uninterrupted for nearly a millennium, and was only shut down in CE 529 due to an imperial order from Byzantium. The real foreign bodies within the polis space, however, were novel epistemic disciplines, especially geometry, arithmetic, and philosophical semantics, the emergence of which shook the community's standards of speech and thought. In order to understand this, we must bear in mind that Plato provocatively claimed that he was putting a definitive end to the disoriented and disorienting chatter of the polis, in order to model political argumentation in the agora on the sciences or mathematics. Although we do not know how serious he was about this, he was able to make his famous demand for the rule of philosopher kings only because he had argued for the transition from a rhetorical democracy to an epistemological aristocracy. Epistemiological? To see why this idea is excessive, we can refer to Aristotle's objection against Platonic epistemocracy. Epistemocracy. Okay. According to Aristotle, political affairs are subject to the law of the probable, not the law of the true, which entails that rational governance can only be oriented by plausibility, not by scientific knowledge. The democratic debate of laypersons is sufficient here, while the conversation of the learned remains appropriate for an extra-political realm. However we care to evaluate the Platonic caesura in the world of Greek discussion, it unquestionably represented a great event in the history of the Western culture of rationality, whose consequences can be traced up to the present day. We would call its modus operandi an epistemic domestication of the logos. The word, logos, itself in the traditional sense, which remains distinct even today, indicates that speech that wishes to be rational in the foundational age of philosophical thought is supposed to undergo a double purification. Its first purgation refers to the doxic origin of true thought. The true logos, initially at least, takes root in the mire of opinion, as even the philosopher concedes, but must then be uprooted from this mire in order to claim independence from any lower genesis. The reasons for the validity of true utterances are only to be found, quote-unquote, above. The second purgation involves isolating true statements from the passions and particular interests of speakers, since with their inevitable agitation the former disturb the ideal of rest, which from this time on is considered the constitutive features of aletheis, logos. The true judgment state of rest is the guarantee of impartiality, without which science is as a comprehensive practice of neutrality and disinterestedness inconceivable. It brings about the intellect's free passivity in receiving the final results of logical and empirical investigations. It is only by means of these two purifications that the improbability known as scientific objectivity can be elevated into a norm and a habitus of the professional and committed pursuit of theory. Faced with these stringent demands, we understand why philosophy as a way of life could at first only be made appealing by recommending it to followers as a path to salvation. It formed the core discipline of academic pacifism, without which old European efforts to institutionalize the logos, whether in academies, cathedral schools, universities, archives, or argumentative media, would be unthinkable. To put this emphatically for a moment, we would have to say that the idea of objectively universal truth is inseparable from the supreme tranquility of contemplation that is supposed to occur as soon as evidence and findings have been taken care of. The philosophical path leads from interest to disinterest, from pathos to apathy, from a position to ascendance above positions. With their efforts come to rest, which alone makes philosophically scientific cognition possible, the most resolute adepts of this new discipline imitate nothing less than the being at rest of the god of the philosophers. He represents a newcomer in the Greek heavens, distinguished toto koelo from the popular gods of Homeric and Hesiodic times by his radicalized cognitive design. Part 2. Divine Cunning, Philosophical Cunning. In contrast, ancient Greek civilization as depicted in the epic tradition and in the succession of mythic rites, mythic tales, yields a completely different picture of the use of intelligence among gods and human beings. This should not be surprising, since even though Homer's gods already enjoy a privilege of theory, they observe human pursuits from an Olympian distance and make sporting wagers on the outcomes of terrestrial skirmishes. Their theoretical attitude initially just means that they are amused as they watch the film of becoming, along with its constantly rotating cast of mortals, but does not yet mean that they possess a comprehensive and unchanging knowledge of the world. Before philosophy, the gods are trapped in pre-epistemic forms of knowledge and the arts, which we see exemplified in the figures of Apollo, Athena, Asclepius, and above all, Hermes. For this reason, we readily encounter frequent manifestations of cunning in their behavioural repertoire: the erotic cunning of Zeus, the strategic cunning of Ares, the mercantile cunning of Hermes. Indeed, even the athletic cunning of the demigod Heracles, who imposes the weight of the firmament upon tired Atlas once more. For rather obvious reasons, a human world full of cunning will flourish beneath a divine sphere pervaded by cunning. The prototype of post-heroic heroism, Odysseus, who not for nothing is endowed in epic poetry with sonorous epithets such as Polytropos, the man who has wandered far and wide, Polymetus, full of cunning, Polymekanos, skilled in many arts, is drawn from such divine models. From now on, we are to understand that intelligence, to the extent that is directed towards practical results, is always also associated with an investment in indirectness, while directness and stupidity are considered to be correlative. The Trojan horse provides the paradigm of Odyssean cunning, representing a masterful unity of artwork, mimesis of an animal's shape, illusion, the pretense of an offering, and a war machine, a vehicle for invasion. Defined in these various senses, it is considered to be the last epitome of profuse cunning, among the Greeks no less than their neighbours in the Imperium Romanum and in modern Europe. Having made these observations, we can perhaps even plausibly understand why the ancient Western culture of rationality, epistemologically and philosophically reoriented after Plato, only allows for a limited understanding of pre-philosophical characteristics of human intelligence, such as cunning. because cunning unequivocally represents an expressive form of strategic, instrumental, and positive rationality. It no longer emerges as an object of research in core areas of philosophical concern. At best, it occasionally surfaces in the marginalised peripheries. There, at least, it receives the philosopher's complete attention, and indeed at a very vital point. We are speaking of the critical sense in which the philosopher watches his doppelganger, the sophist, emerge, that deceptive mimic of a sage, a sham version of the one who truly knows, who from then on is to be unmasked and exposed, quote-unquote, by any means necessary. The first, and for a long time only, case in which the philosopher is not merely allowed a cunning of reason, but required to have one, is to be found in the sophistic throwing down of the gauntlet, which, as we now understand, simultaneously implied the calling into question of a logos without cunning, by a logos that continued to be cunning. In this context, the phrase, quote-unquote, by any means necessary, becomes problematic. To be sure, the philosopher, in fending off the sophistic movement, must find his own way to convey a pathos, an ardour, an interest, even a will to victory, and must lead an apparatus that reflects this into the field. He is allowed to do this insofar as he is engaged with an implacable foe who never aims at anything but to serve partial interests, to craft deceptive tricks, and to seek out crooked, artful, indirect ways to victory. Nevertheless, the philosopher may not become a sophist himself if he does not want to lose his superior ontological position. To fight against the sophistic movement, quote-unquote, by any means necessary, thus means precisely to finish off a cunning adversary with the ultimate cunning, the cunning of reason. Yet, the cunning of logos is reason's own disciplined activity, the fabrication of conceptuality. Insofar as the latter is understood, the latter is supposed to enable rule over things that have been illuminated and understood. The sophist is defeated by the cunning of reason the moment that reason provides the true concept of the sophist. In this singular dispute, the labour of the concept and the cunning of reason are one and the same. In the course of the dialogue, sophist, after protracted definitions, we finally learn that the philosopher's evil doppelganger is the deliberate illusionist, the professional deceiver, the all-too agile and elusive fabricator of cunning paralogisms. This is what Plato triumphantly brings to light at the end of the dialogue, with rather dry logic. The quote-unquote true sophist, and one should note the irony of the term, is descended from the line of those who are engaged in the following, quotes, imitation of the contrary speech-producing, insincere and unknowing sort, of the appearance-making kind of copy-making, the word-juggling part of production that's marked off as human and not divine, end quote. The philosopher's cunning rival is conceptually articulated in this definition, which contains a number of distinctive features. He is thus petrified, so to speak, and can subsequently be displayed once and for all outside of campus, like a statue of eternal falseness. The cunning of the concept is evident in its exposure of the sophist as such, in its capturing of the sophist's essential nature in a definitive portrait. Or to use a different image, the concept is the philosopher's pharmakon, as it were. If the sophist accidentally takes it, he will end up permanently paralysed. In contrast, if those seeking the truth take it, they are forever immunised against the risk of succumbing to sophistic suggestions. Reference to the banishment of the sophists from the epistemic field does not, of course, merely involve the attempt by academics to get rid of a vexing competitor on the pedagogical market. As we have indicated, it is, in fact, characterises a restyling of intellectual activity, so that the latter is more transpersonally motivated. From this point on, the truth is only supposed to deserve to be called the truth, to the extent that the behaviour of those inquiring into it is non-strategic. This requires assuming that contemplation has precedence in the final analysis, a condition that was relatively easy to meet within the framework of ancient objectivism. If knowledge signifies the reflection of a nature, or a state of affairs in an intellect, as the tradition teaches, then contemplation per se is the recommended path to it, which does not mean that the discursive preparations for contemplation may be bypassed. Inquiring reason is undoubtedly worthwhile in itself, but as soon as it is concerned with results, it changes course from activity to passivity. The learned members of medieval Europe understood this fact when they formulated that intelligere est quodum pati, translated, to come to know is to suffer something. In this saying we can still hear echoes of the venerable rhyme cited by the Greeks, mathein, pathein, to learn and to suffer. What we referred to above as the disarming of thinkers and their alienation from given opinions, in fact, aims at the development of an artificial subject that does not spontaneously occur in nature. An inquirer who is qualified to become the authentic bearer of knowledge to the degree that he has become depathologized and disinterested in the ascesis of thought. The alienation between knowledge and strategy in the old European culture of rationality is thus ultimately conditioned by the fact that those who think have to undergo a decontextualization and a depersonalization, after which they can no longer simply function as advocates of a particular interest. They no longer receive their mandate from human clients and their interests, nor from what is called quote-unquote society, but present themselves as delegates of the objective amidst the bleak confusion of polemical and pathological partisan intellectuals. Whoever treads upon the path of philosophical knowledge has to pay a high price, but a price that is simultaneously supposed to convey the distinction of being able to pay the price. Knowledge requires nothing less than a social death, a radical act of non-solidarity in relation to tribal idols, and the transition to a supra-ethnic system of solidarity with those seeking the truth. And this is the deeper meaning of the ancient concept of the cosmopolis, as it was popularized from the days of the Stoa on, and which partially survived into the 19th century as an important ideal of the European university. It indicates the noble homelessness of the philosopher, who is supposed to know that he is in exile wherever he may be in the empirical world. In antiquity, this negative situation tended to be expressed in positive terms, by emphasizing the sage's capacity to be at home everywhere. The cosmopolitanism of philosophy was not merely based on the intellect's free floating between homelands and above partisan wrangling. It also led to xenophilia, so that it ended the age-old privileging of what was familiar in comparison to the foreign. Ever since we drank from the river of oblivion, true ideas alienate us, although they correspond to our oldest memories according to Plato, and so we must become estranged from ourselves in order to again make contact with what is really and truly our own. Not for nothing did Plato have a xenos, the stranger, enter the scene at several strategically important points in his dialogues, particularly sophist and statesman. Reflecting on the alienation of philosophers and scientists from the interests of the communities they originated in may be useful for helping us to understand one of the most conspicuous basic features of the Western culture of reason: the relative strategic blindness of academic pursuits. In fact, there are no quote-unquote embedded philosophers in the European tradition, and even where one professes to pursue practical philosophy, as a rule such engagement is just as quixotic, weltfremd, and impractical as other academic affairs. Only in more recent times, particularly since Heidegger's phenomenological research and a more modern theory of science, have we witnessed attempts to overcome philosophical reflection's notorious lack of position and situation by formulating a theory of situated reflection and the embedding of reason and research within the life world. In this regard, a few names are paramount: Jean-Paul Sartre, Hermann Schmitz, and Bruno Latour. .3. This is part 3, the outwitting of human reason. It would be hasty to conclude from what we have just said that these various old European conceptions of reason did not bear any relation at all to the phenomenon of cunning, or, to put it more generally, to a method for the indirect realization of goals. On the contrary, over the course of the last 2 millennia, a variety of figures have emerged who make it possible for us to illustrate in detail how what we ordinarily consider to be reason, primarily theoretical, anti-sophistic, without interests and above positions, becomes involved with the cunning of superior entities, regardless of whether these entities are addressed as God, nature, idea, or history. Indeed, as we have seen on its own terms, philosophically and epistemically informed intelligence is not supposed to be in the service of particular interests, pursuing them with partisan cunning and narrow-minded zeal. Yet it can become the object of a superior cunning, particularly when the constraints of the human intellect provoke the intervention of agents operating on a higher level, who pursue superhuman goals by way of human efforts. Conversely, reason can also begin to seem like the subject of a campaign in which we do not have to fight a particular opponent, but have to overcome a superpersonal adversary that is represented by such concepts as nature, lack, necessity, and alienation. In the first case, human reason, or human individuality, has itself been duped, such that there is talk of a cunning of reason, with quote-unquote of being used in the sense of an objective genitive. In the second case, human reason reimburses itself for the costs of a generalized other, which is why the subjective genitive is more fitting here. In what follows, I would like to suggest a few lines of thought that ought to be considered in an intellectual history of duped reason. I will show how talk about the outwitting of human understanding by a higher intelligence is profoundly anchored in the traditions of old European ontology, while talk of outwitting that is without reason, through artful human reasoning, represents the underlying characteristic feature of rationalism in the modern era. The first kind of outwitting is generally, but not always, associated with mostly forgotten theories of the intellect on the threshold between theology and epistemology, while the second kind is readily apparent in quintessentially modern theories of technology that are articulated on the threshold between the philosophy of nature and the art of engineering. Articulations of the active cunning of reason have been part of Europe's strategic law since the 16th century, and have also played a primary role in aesthetics during this time. An account of the ways in which an outwitted human reason has manifested itself would inevitably have to begin by recalling Platonic holism. Here we need only refer to the arguments made in Plato's late work, Laws, to bring young men who were inclined to atheism back onto the theistic path. The philosopher draws on a stark ontological ordering principle, according to which a superior creative intelligence arranges the cosmos so that every single thing works together, each in its own place. Order primarily means the seamless integration of parts into the whole. The Athenian stranger, the main speaker in the dialogue, thus remarks, quote, "These parts, down to the smallest details of their active and passive functions, have each been put under the control of ruling powers that have perfected the minutest constituents of the universe. Now then, you perverse fellow, one such part, a mere speck that nevertheless constantly contributes to the good of the whole, is you. You have forgotten that nothing is created except to provide the entire universe with a life of prosperity. You forget that creation is not for your benefit. You exist for the sake of the universe." End quote. The goal of argumentation, not without sophistic elements, is quite evidently persuasion. The speaker would like to convince potential and actual dissidents, or those who are lawless, to give up on the abduction of substantive truth based on ignorance and to return to a lawful sphere. The key performative term in the speech can be found in the doctrine, quote-unquote, "you who have forgotten." On the one hand, it points to the doctrine, further elaborated by Plato elsewhere, that no one does wrong willingly, which secures the thesis that everyone is fundamentally educable and also in need of education. And on the other hand, it reveals an incisive irony, insofar as the lawless person, who thinks himself more clever than those who are content and integrated, is portrayed as truly ignorant. He allows himself to be duped by the world's empirically conspicuous deficit of rationality, by the appearance of disorder and randomness, and hence misses the logical master plan in which sovereign intellects, all the way up to the intellectus archetypos, have ordered the universe. The plan that philosophy is always seeking with receptive admiration as it goes about inquiring and extrapolating. In our present context, it should be enough to recognise that with this warning to godless realists, the topos that, quote, "the seemingly clever are the foolish ones," end quote, is established for future ages. It implies renouncing the popular belief that we learn from our mistakes. In contrast, it aims to demonstrate how we become fools by critically remaining mistaken. This line of thought, which amounts to the repression of regard for the negative, will be most conspicuous where it is considered necessary to have no doubt at all that the world is rationally ordered. The Stoic doctrine of an all-pervasive providence of cosmic reason is all the evidence we need for this quite broad thesis. In this doctrine, the momentous philosopheme of a foreseeing and foreordaining power of the Logos emerges, which is addressed as pronoia, and that recurs after its theological metamorphosis as predestination. From a functional, or theoretical architectonic perspective, it is the task of providence, Vorsehung, to absorb the future's openness and to incorporate future contingencies into the ordered structure of the universe, as it has been determined from the beginning. Thus only the individual human being, with his inability to understand, which is felt quite strongly in situations of suffering, stands out as an exception. This exceptional status, however, is not supposed to signify foolish behaviour, a willful disregard for the good reasons that one must ultimately be able to find for everything. In his lectures on the basic doctrines that typified ancient philosophical schools, with a notable emphasis on their agreement, Max Pollens notes that, quote, "in the case of global catastrophes such as earthquakes, we feel compelled to believe that, in view of the whole, Providence is imposing a penalty or engaging in a purification, and we do not allow ourselves to run into danger, even if innocence may be affected. We must always think of the whole, of its greatness, purposiveness, and beauty. Nagging criticism is then silenced." End quote. According to this logic, the mind that insists on criticism is excluded from insight into the world's purposive structure. It forever remains a loser that allows itself to be duped time after time by a worldwide pronoia. It would be fascinating to read, synoptically, the complex history of Platonic, Aristotelian, and Stoic theories of the intellect, along with their extension by medieval Arabic philosophers and European successors. To pull this off, such a reading would have to be structured broadly enough to allow us to also properly see the methodical pursuit of the humiliation and duping of human intelligence. A sensitive chapter in this history would be devoted to the Augustinian metaphysics of predestination, which very well may be the darkest moment in the European history of ideas. Augustine may have offered one of the most subtle interpretations of human reason when he attempted to show the traces of the Trinity within it. Yet, because of his doctrine that human nature is corrupted by original sin, he irrationally obscured the relationship between divine and human intelligence, so that even the most intense religious feeling, the striving for salvation of the soul, was necessarily affected. If our religious obligation requires us to spread the word, if we must encourage many of our brothers and sisters to strive for salvation, then an inscrutable, even dreadful irony lies concealed in Augustine's admonition. Divine omniscience, which acts in unity with divine omnipotence, by virtue of its unfathomable arbitrary mercy, has decreed that only chosen individuals may be saved in small numbers, according to criteria that seem unclear to human beings, while the great majority of Christendom, not to mention all non-Christians, are condemned to eternal damnation in advance. The Augustinian dictum, in experimentis volvimur, we are rolled from test to test, perfectly expresses foreordination's macabre duping of human intelligence. On such a view, a wrathful God, wearing the mask of benevolence, seems to use Christendom as bait to lure humanity into recognizing his sovereignty and his right to grant pardon, though he will only opt for the latter in the rarest of cases. As a result, the immense majority of ordinary Christians, despite all of their ascetic practices and confessions, still remain included in the massa perditionis, the mass of the corrupted, and will plunge headlong into the depths, however much they would like to delude themselves about the possibility and likelihood of their salvation. The cunning of such arbitrary mercy remains inscrutable. Kurt Flash has aptly remarked in this regard that, quote, Augustine's God seems like a teacher for whom only a small number of arbitrarily favoured students make the grade. He watches as the majority of human beings are unable to do anything with their good will, end quote. Part 4. Outwitting for the sake of the outwitted. We get a completely different impression the moment we consider versions of the figure of outwitted reason in the modern age. As a rule, they exhibit a tendency towards clarification. They offer insight into a series of processes and situations in which we might speak of an outwitting that serves the interests of the outwitted. We must content ourselves here by referring to a few exemplary remarks offered by authors such as Giordano Bruno, Kant, Hegel, and Schopenhauer. We have the first author on that list to thank for the most impressive version of a fortunate kind of duping. In his work Degli eroici furori, the heroic frenzies, authored in London in 1585, Bruno retold the myth of the hunter Actaeon and gave it a surprising philosophical twist. Actaeon has spied on the goddess Artemis while she bathed in the forest, whereupon the outraged goddess transformed him into a stag or a buck, which was torn to pieces by her pack of dogs, so that he would not tell others that he had seen her in the nude. Bruno, incidentally, was familiar with hunting metaphors from late medieval activist theories of the intellect, through the later work of Nicholas of Cusa, titled De Venatione Sapientiae. Thus for Bruno, Actaeon, quote, signifies the intellect intent on hunting divine wisdom, on grasping divine beauty, end quote. Divine subject matter now has to reckon with the guile of objects. They necessarily elude the one seeking them, so long as he or she pursues them merely in terms of their external appearance. They only reveal themselves to the one seeking them when they are conceived in the mode of interiority, that is to say, by their transformation into the seeker's subjectivity. The thing that has been cognized abandons its position as object and shifts over to become subject, winning those who are cognizing over to its side, so to speak. Bruno summarised the state of affairs with the words of Tansillo, a participant in the dialogue. Quote, "Thus Actaeon, with those thoughts, those dogs, who sought outside himself for goodness, wisdom, beauty, the wild creatures, arrived into the presence of that prey, and was enraptured outside himself by such beauty. He became prey himself, and saw himself converted into what he sought. He realised then that he himself had turned into the longed-for prey of his own dogs, of his own thoughts. Because once he had contracted divinity into himself, he no longer needed to seek it outside himself." End quote. The figure of duping for the sake of the duped is prolific in the 16th century history of ideas, with most versions a little more bombastic than the inversion of hunter and prey found in Bruno's Myth of Epiphany. If, in the Nolan's case, we have what might be called a cunning of the absolute, in Immanuel Kant's case we would have to speak of an episodic cunning of nature, in a series of anthropological writings and works of political theory which can be considered precursors to the history of philosophy, particularly in the essays Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose from 1784 and Perpetual Peace from 1795. Kant hypothetically introduced the figure of a teleology of nature, according to which nature as a whole can be thought of, semi-allegorically, as a kind of provident schoolmistress who uses indirect methods to divert her pupils from their harmful inclinations, to harness them for rational ends. Thus she sees to it that her problem student, the human being, despite a selfish nature that is resistant to reason, is ultimately impelled onto the unlikely path of progress and world peace. Kant is aware that he thereby attributes to nature a role that, in the metaphysical religious tradition, was given to providence. Yet he does not underestimate how far removed speculations of this sort are from the terra firma of solid inquiry. Not for nothing does he remark near the end of his essay from 1784, under the 8th proposition, in an almost confessional tone, quote, "One sees that philosophy too can have its chiliastic effects," end quote, although he immediately continues his digression into the adventurous, quote, "It is for that reason anything but fanciful," end quote. Kant's doctrine of natural intentionality, which wished to be sober despite its exuberance, emphasized the tendency of natural evolution to at some point develop all of its creatures' natural endowments, completely and expediently. A few sentences later, he formally expresses how the evolutionary cunning of nature is to be understood. Quote, "The means that nature employs in order to bring about the development of all of the predispositions of humans is their antagonism in society, insofar as this antagonism ultimately becomes the cause of a law-governed organization of society. Here I take antagonism to mean the unsociable sociability of human beings, that is, their tendency to enter into a society, a tendency connected, however, with a constant resistance that continually threatens to break up this society." End quote. Kant confidently affirms that without the influence of antagonistic forces, the endowments of the species would necessarily be condemned to remain undeveloped in a pastoral, Arcadian dream world. Quote, "Thank nature for their quarrelsomeness, for their jealously competitive vanity, and for their insatiable appetite for property and even for power. Without these, all the excellent natural human predispositions would lie in eternal slumber, undeveloped. Humans desire harmony, but nature knows better what is good for their species. It wills discord. Humans wish to live leisurely and enjoy themselves, but nature wills that human beings abandon their sloth and passive contentment and thrust themselves into work and hardship." End quote. Depicted in this manner, Kantian nature assumes the features of a schoolmistress, indeed of a scrupulous factory director, who acts in a strategically clever, but morally questionable manner, to realise her intentions indirectly. At the same time, Kant's argument does not merely provide a philosophical justification of discomfort, it also explicitly sketches a historical pathodicy, a justification of human suffering, including morally objectionable vices, insofar as both dynamically advance the civilizing process by inciting progress. Part 5. Hegel, the Cunning of Reason. After Kant's semi-allegorical talk of natural intentions became an established language game, it fell to his successors to conceptualize still other superhuman entities that harness human beings as a means to various higher purposes. Without doubt, the most famous example of this is in the phrase coined by Hegel in the introduction to his Lectures on the Philosophy of History, years 1822 through to 1831, that of the quote-unquote cunning of reason. This famous passage is found in the postscript to Hegel's Berlin lectures. Quote, "This may be called the cunning of reason, that it sets the passions to work for itself. The idea, capitalized, pays the penalty of determinate existence and of corruptibility, not from itself, but from the passions of individuals." End quote. In the light of traditional figures of the duped human intellect, this statement offers nothing new, considered by itself. We once more easily recognize in it the arrangement that usually emerges in the process of the indirect realization of goals by an intelligent being that has been outwitted, the envelopment of local human plans and intentions by a more general plan and a higher level intention. Hegel's formulation, which is not entirely without reason, is one of the most well-known in his oeuvre, is as popular as it is open to more subtle interpretations. At first glance, we might not view it as much more than an elegant recasting of the proverb according to which man proposes, God disposes. Der Mensch denkt, Gott lenkt. On a more subtle interpretation, we would have to work out how the quote-unquote idea, elevated by Hegel into the guiding principle of history, displays the virtues of a far-sighted strategist. The idea sees to it that the chronicle of humanity does not merely remain, to speak with Macbeth, quote, "a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury," end quote, but can be recounted as a report on the always circuitous process of reason through space and time. It may not be entirely illegitimate to consider whether we do not hear in Hegel's argument an echo of the ideas on political economy offered by Bernard Mandeville and Adam Smith, already present earlier in Kant, according to which the market's regulative power, though based on amoral motives, leads to worthwhile results, a kind of precursor to functionalism and cybernetics. The real model for Hegel's phrase, quote-unquote, cunning of reason, might nevertheless be found in classical philosophy, particularly in Plato's explanations of the trichotomous structure of the human psyche. On Plato's account, the human soul possesses three parts: two emotional motors, whose specifications can be roughly characterized with such terms as lust, eros, and spiritedness, thymos, and a piloting function that is free of emotions, the so-called logistikon, the site of the capacity of reason. As a psychologist, Plato already possesses a schema for the cunning of reason, insofar as in his model one part of the soul, which does not have any energy of its own, plays the other two parts off of each other in order to obtain its own ends. And this generally happens in such a way that the organ of reason mobilizes sensitive spiritedness in matters of honour, in order to stem the potentially offensive inclinations of the lustful part of the soul, while the latter is called upon to offset thymotic surges. In light of this analogy, Hegel's dictum, particularly its second part, becomes a good deal more understandable, since even in the philosophy of history, the quote-unquote idea, as a logisticon of higher status, has the empirical, all too empirical emotions of historical individuals pay the price for the higher ends of reason. This means that if reason does not wish to remain impotently otherworldly and unreal, but to be historically incarnated in the world, it must work with worldly and historical forces. Such empirical emotions, mainly thymotic or honour-seeking impulses, form the basis for the emergence of great actors in world history. We cannot fail to note that here too, as in Smith and Kant, an amoralism in the service of morality becomes prominent. In contrast, Hegelian irony, according to which the extraordinary actively serves the ordinary, is unconventional, insofar as all dramatic historical incidents end up fading into a post-historical, undramatic constitutional normalism. As in the Chinese doctrine of cunning, reason as portrayed by Hegel has the appearance of a military commander who always kills with someone else's knife. Strategy number 3 of the 36 stratagems on Sun Tzu's list. Cunning reason is a subordinate function of the historical dialectic. Grisly violence, and Hegel's protagonists from Alexander to Napoleon are reckless when it comes to such violence, works towards the salutary goal of establishing a world constitution characterized by the rule of law with minimal violence. When considering all of this, we should not overlook the fact that the famous phrase, quote-unquote, the cunning of reason, despite its succinctness, remains nothing more than an ad hoc formulation. Hegel himself did not further elaborate it, and indeed for reasons that are to be sought in the logic of his system. His doctrine is emphatically conceived of as a system of freedom, in which reason's working its way out of the heteronomous conditions it emerged from is on display. Thus it is not in the thinker's interest to push the free subject in service to this idea so far that a new way of being determined by something alien would arise, as would happen if the human mind were completely outwitted by the world mind. To the extent that the agents of history should always be taken seriously as bearers of the historical impulse towards freedom, the interests of the idea or of reason's superordinate plan might not be entirely free from the well-understood motivations of human agents, but would have to engage with them in the mode of a semi-transparent kind of cooperation. It must still be said that a quote-unquote progressive version of an outwitting in the interests of the outwitted is also encountered in Hegel, in keeping with the prevailing illuminative tendency of the modern Enlightenment culture of reason. Part 6. Schopenhauer, Cunning of the Will. We are faced with a different picture as soon as we turn to post-Hegelian ways of expressing the duping of reason. If darker tendencies surface here, this is due to the naturalistic and functionalistic tendency that shaped thinking about development in the 19th and 20th centuries. From a naturalist and functionalist perspective, human cognition no longer seems to be the earthly projection of a divine intellect, but an organ, or an archetype of programs that have been developed to ensure vital progress on a meta-vital level, or the reflection of the social on the intellectual level. New types of outwitting emerge in this constellation, essentially maintaining the functional alliance between coping with the world and self-deception. Numerous forms of the post-Hegelian critique of reason and ideology target this alliance. I will content myself with a single example. Schopenhauer's doctrine of the metaphysics of sexual love, as we find it in the notorious 44th chapter in the second volume of The World as Will and Representation, a passage in which one can recognise the philosophical matrix of Viennese psychoanalysis. First, it must be admitted that Schopenhauer's statements on sexuality are not yet those of a completely devoted naturalism, but rather stem from a semi-naturalistic psychological theory with a conception of nature that is articulated on the basis of a metaphysics of the will. At critical points, the philosopher's argumentative strategy anticipates later figures of cryptic duping. It amounts to ironizing the illusion of freedom in human agents by revealing that we do not handle the most important matters, but rather are handled by them. Schopenhauer believed that there was no subject that could be more convincingly treated than the love life of human beings. This infiltration of a desire experienced as, quote-unquote, our own, by an underlying agent. Even if the love-struck individual obeys an impulse or believes that he or she has obeyed an impulse that arises from deep within, the philosopher still maintains that love is nothing more than the personal guise of a pre-personal force that is directed toward the blind reproduction of the species. The author developed an empathetic interpretation of human love by taking its heavenliness and its hellishness, in terms of the metaphysics of the will, more seriously than any author before him. He thus remarks, quote, "This longing and this pain of love cannot draw their material from the needs of an ephemeral individual. On the contrary, they are the sighs of the spirit of the species, which sees here, to be won or lost, an irreplaceable means to its ends, and therefore groans deeply. The species alone has infinite life, and is therefore capable of infinite desire, infinite satisfaction, and infinite sufferings. But these are here imprisoned in the narrow breast of a mortal." End quote. Schopenhauer subsequently, somewhat cavalierly, adopts the Kantian practice of indulging in speculations about the intentions of nature. In the manner of the best teleology of nature, the philosopher offers a half-psychological, half-metaphysical explanation of the lover's tendency to highly idealize the object of his or her desire. Quote, "Now, in this case, the sexual impulse, though in itself a subjective need, knows how to assume very skillfully the mask of an objective admiration, and thus to deceive consciousness, for nature requires this stratagem in order to attain her ends." End quote. We can easily recognise how Schopenhauer's natural strategic derivation of the sublime here anticipates an essential argument of psychoanalytical naturalism, the reduction of erotic idealistic phantasms to libidinal urges rooted in the drives. We should bear in mind that types of cunning reason such as this lose their basis in the theory of the intellect as they transition into the realm of nature. As philosophical theories about the emotions, or as doctrines of quote-unquote necessary false consciousness, they concern the outwitting of experienced motives by the more powerful forces of unconscious drives and collective functions. Anyone who would like to learn more about the development of these and similar theories can consult Heinz Dieter Kitzsteiner's book Wir werden gelebt, whose title is taken from the phrase of Sigmund Freud's, as a guide through the jagged terrain of the post-Hegelian critiques of consciousness. Part 7. Nature Outwitted. Mechanical Engineering. At this point I will cease sketching a history of duped subjectivity, or the passive experience of cunning, and would like to conclude with a brief allusion to a few motifs of active cunning in modern Europe's culture of rationality. I would like to cite 5 fields or disciplines in which the active use of cunning has tended to manifest itself in the course of Western civilization since the 16th century. In the first place, we should here think of mechanical engineering, which gave a superpersonal and serial form to European cunning. Next, we should consider the literature of worldly wisdom as it flourished in the setting of absolutist courts and metropolises, with their worlds of intrigue. A short word will have to suffice for the studies on war and policy in the early modern era, and last but not least, we should refer to the system of arts that crystallised in late feudal, early bourgeois society, and then freely flourished in the production of entertaining and edifying illusions. The most influential example of the culture of cunning that is specific to Europe in the modern era is to be found in mechanical engineering, as it was developed in the Old World, associated with ancient models from the 16th century on. To a certain extent, the European art of mechanical engineering freed cunning from its dependence on specific situations, and developed into a praxis of cunning in general, of cunning sans phrase. A machine is a stratagem whose implementation does not require a strategist. Hence, the cunning European operator does not develop an explicit awareness of cunning to enjoy the benefits of typical operations of machinery. It suffices to fulfill the role of an operator in an appropriate manner. Over the course of centuries, various technologies for power transmission, using gear trains, pulleys, screw presses, and pendulum systems, complemented the discovery of the lever. Around 1500, a historic technological breakthrough, in sociological terms, finally occurred when Peter Henlein invented the pocket watch, his famous Nuremberg eggs. Due to innovations in precision mechanics by the Guild of Clockmakers, the modern art of mechanical engineering achieved a prestige that indicated a new paradigm in relations between human beings and nature. Thus, the mechanical clock was elevated into the universal gadget of the Renaissance and the Baroque. Not only did it offer concrete and descriptive models of the world, particularly with the technical marvel of the grand complication, which could display the permanent calendar along with the phases of the moon and planetary orbits. Mechanical clockworks and gear trains became metaphors for the world whose predominance only came to an end with the emergence of first-generation thermodynamic machines, the steam engines. Mechanical engineering in the early modern era can be regarded as a technological translation of the maxim natura non nisi parendo vincetur, nature is only conquered by obedience, propounded by Francis Bacon in his Novum Organum. If ancient mechanics had already been understood by the Greeks to be a pragmatic art of outwitting nature, then Bacon's law that one must obey in order to rule provided a general concept for the principle of this art of outwitting. Because it is depersonalized and decontextualized, technological cunning does not have individual applications. Thus we have a process in which an increasing number of operators become able to handle machines, and hence to participate in the technological power of manipulating nature. The principle of nisi parendo is grounded in the turn to experimental methods which entail a systematic investigation of nature in terms of its regularity. This has traditionally involved an image of nature as only reluctantly willing to unveil itself, yet susceptible to being compelled to betray its secrets of cunning and the coercion of science. Obedience to nature thus signifies the faint of faints, by means of which the universal commander, Western humanity as Baconian progressive collective, exploits a nature that is more outwitted than respected, for the sake of human interests. Part 8. Our outwitted fellow man. The very same Francis Bacon, following the models of Montaigne's essays from 1580, considered the rules for cleverly accomplishing one's goals in the strategic interactions of courtiers and merchants. The enormous success of this new literary genre indicates the extent to which actors on the early modern social stage were interested in rules offering advice for conducting operations in a realm expanded by trade, seafaring, science, and technology. If we may relate the essay as a literary form to experimental thought in general, we should realize that the variety of new treatments of worldly wisdom opened up a specific kind of access to the field of strategic cunning. In his 20-second essay, On Cunning, Bacon himself compiles a short list of rhetorical and practical advice, which can obviously be read as a rudimentary form of strategic consultancy for courtly and mercantile clientele. In enumerating this list, personal experiences converge with general advice in a seemingly humorous manner. Quote, "I knew one," Bacon notes, "that when he wrote a letter, he would put that which was most material in the postscript, as if it had been a by-matter. I knew another that when he came to have speech, he would pass over that he intended most, and go forth and come back again and speak of it as a thing that he had almost forgotten. There is a cunning, which we in England call the turning of the cat in the pan, which is when that which a man says to another, he lays it as if another had said it to him. It is strange how long some men will lie in wait to speak something they desire to say. It is a thing of great patience, but yet of much use." End quote. From the 17th century on, the literary market aroused and met an insatiable demand for advisers on existence in a world whose design was increasingly determined by the imperatives of the rivalry between courtiers, bourgeoisie, and the merchant class. The genres of strategic life coaching flourished, collections of maxims, books on etiquette, doctrines of an art of life, textbooks on human anthropology, writings on worldly wisdom, overshadowing anything similar from earlier or later times. What Spanish cultural history called its siglo de oro signified a golden age of strategic reason for all of Europe. Both from the perspective of those who were interested in actively practicing the arts of illusion, as well as from the perspective of those who, since they could see through the illusions of others, wished to be esteemed for their perfection of worldly wisdom. Insofar as the significant authors of the 17th century promised their clientele a broad training in resisting deception, we might characterize this era as the incubation period of the Enlightenment, where enlightenment is to be understood as not merely a time in which the sciences were popularized, paradigmatically exemplified in the project of the French encyclopedists, but as the melee of urban intelligence with the omnipresent forces of illusion at work in courtly life and the marketplace. One of the key experiences of the epoch is the realization that the human being himself is now able to become the genius malignos of the human being. In this regard, it is entirely symptomatic as well as typical of philosophy when Descartes, in his doubt experiment, brings the possibility of deception to an acute fever pitch. He hypothetically conceives, je supposerai, of, quote, an evil genius supremely powerful and clever, end quote. Non moins rusé et trompeur que puissant. Again, I apologise for my lack of French. One day I'll do something about it. Who would be able to make it so that all of my perceptions, quote, are the bedeviling hoaxes of my dreams with which he lays snares for my credulity, end quote. Des illusions et tromperies dont il se sert pour surprendre ma credulité. Unlike the Cartesian philosopher, the 17th century man of the world does not adhere firmly to the principle of incontrovertible evidence at all. He invests in the virtues of a dualist, such as mobility and presence of mind, and develops a gymnastics of mistrust that allows him to remain sovereign in everyday scuffles with illusions and seductive temptations. No system of true knowledge is established by this man of the world enlightenment. It is enough to merely ensure our own sobriety by studying the underside of the carpet that, with its thousands of knots, conditions the world illusion on top, to use one of Cervantes' images. The general principle for this worldview can be found in Balthazar Gracian's advice, in his The Art of Worldly Wisdom from 1647, that in matters of importance we must look within human beings. If we had to pick a single example that documents the tone and tendency of the literature for training modern human beings in the rigours of moral and strategic fitness, then it would have to be the masterpiece of the genre, which contained the passage cited above by the Jesuit-educated Gratian. It can justifiably be claimed that every single one of the 300 rules of worldly wisdom and aphoristic maxims of the portable oracle, Oraculo Manual, represents an extract from a wealth of strategic situations. Every single aphorism is a theatre of the world in microcosm. Each line seems like it is trying to prove that every human being must now become a political realist. Where deception is everything, we must be discreetly clever. We could claim here the discreto, in close proximity to the figure of the picaro, steps onto the stage, the modern age's first intellectual, as member of an artful precariat. We read in a key aphorism that, quote-unquote, man's life is a warfare against the malice of men, and thus a permanent struggle between aggressive cunning and discreet attentiveness. Human knowledge now means knowledge of the world, and this includes insight into the strategies that the combatant must master in a continually precarious partisan jockeying for position. In this regard, I would like to cite Rule 26, quote, find out each man's thumbscrew. 'Tis the art of setting their wills in action. It needs more skill than resolution. You must know where to get at any one. Every volition has a special motive that varies according to taste. All men are idolaters, some of fame, others of self-interest, most of pleasure. Skill consists in knowing these idols in order to bring them into play. Knowing any man's mainspring of motive, you have as it were the key to his will. Have resort to primary motives, which are not always the highest, but more often the lowest part of his nature. There are more dispositions badly organised than well. First, guess a man's ruling passion, appeal to it by a word, set it in motion by temptation, and you will infallibly give checkmate to his freedom of will. End quote. As in many other passages of the manual, Gratian here adopts the perspective of offering amoral advice on an anthropological basis, advice that is admittedly general in order to provide his reader with insight into the calculations of potential opposing parties. Sometimes this turns into an outright denunciation of aristocratic cunning, as in aphorism 149, quote, know how to put off ills on others. To have a shield against ill will is a great piece of skill in a ruler. It is not the resort of incapacity, as ill wishers imagine, but it is due to the higher policy of having someone to receive the censure of the disaffected and the punishment of universal detestation. Everything cannot turn out well, nor can every one be satisfied. It is well, therefore, even at the cost of our pride, to have such a scapegoat, such a target for unlucky undertakings. End quote. In making this observation, the author calls attention to the risks of jobs involving the future, such as secretario, aristocratic advisor, and lawyer. Anyone who runs the risk of getting close to the powerful and their secrets should know that they can lose their life in the bargain. Even Francis Bacon was aware of this when, in his work De Sapientia Veterum, of the Wisdom of the Ancients from 1609, though it only appeared in English for the first time in 1619, an anthology of interpretations of ancient myths considered as rationalistic allegories, he translated the story of Metis, who emerged from the union of sky and earth, into a contemporary idiom. Metis, a titan assigned to the planet Mercury, was regarded as the goddess of cunning or wisdom. We read in Bacon's translation that, quote, the ancient poets tell us that Jupiter took Metis, whose name plainly signifies counsel, to wife, that she conceived by him and was with child, which he perceiving did not wait till she brought forth, but ate her up, whereby he became himself with child. But his delivery was of a strange kind, for out of his head or brain he brought forth Pallas, armed. This monstrous and at first sight very foolish fable contains, as I interpret, a secret of government. It describes the art whereby kings so deal with the councils of state. But when the question grows ripe for a decision, which is the bringing forth, they do not allow the council to deal any further in it, lest their acts should seem to be dependent upon the council's will. They take into their own hands whatever has been by the council elaborated, so that the decision and execution may seem to emanate from themselves." End quote. In the myth of Metis, Bacon makes two things clear. On the one hand, he puts his finger on power's increasing dependence on advisement. On the other, he indicates that princes, insofar as they have to provide a spectacle of wise governance, must transform themselves into modern-day sophists. The necessary union of ruling and sophistry in the enlightenment of princes has never been more vibrantly imagined than in the legends of the goddess of cunning, who was swallowed whole. She is sometimes also portrayed as holding the position of a counsellor, which incidentally is also a way of handling the theme that a clever woman is always the source of a powerful man's words. This neo-sophistic situation led to the development of a few literary genres that reached their apex with the French moralists. The most significant configuration of a new strategic fostering of reason, Nietzsche's The Gay Science, whose subtitle, La Gaia Scienza, openly suggests its Spanish influences, was crucially indebted to these new genres. Paradigmatic examples of the literature on the art of war and the science of policy in modern Europe have not been of much philosophical interest. Or, if they were, it was only insofar as writings of this kind and with this orientation make it possible to document the renaissance of strategic reason. Anyone prepared to note the differentiation of cultures of rationality in the modern Western Hemisphere must turn our attention to manifestations of this literature. We limit ourselves here to observing that the more recent library of the strategic sciences, which extends from Karl von Clausewitz through Hans Delbrück all the way to Raymond Aron, John Keegan and Edward Luttwak, develops an elaborate universe of literature on the theory of war. Similarly, a library of Baroque literature on statecraft, which is concerned with the art of quote-unquote policy, reader's note, spelt in the old way there, as a cunning technique for guiding communities, paved the way for the more recent science of politics, which stretches from Montesquieu to John Rawls. This literature's homage to the genius of indirect reason results from its subject matter. Its strategic tendencies help explain why its basic thrust was no longer understood by the later bourgeois Enlightenment, and why it was condemned wholesale, although, almost a contemporary, Kant calls the older policy law the, quote, twists and turns of an amoral doctrine of prudence, end quote, and condemns it for its incompatibility with the upright disposition of direct goodwill. In the essay Towards Perpetual Peace, Kant enumerates 3 sophistic maxims that in his opinion sum up every stratagem of the bad, older statecraft in a nutshell. Fac et excusa, taking a chance and then making excuses afterwards. Si facesti nega, denying doing anything and blame someone else. Divide et impera, sow discord between party leaders and alienate them from the people. In the same work, Kant calls for the condemnation of the Jesuit reservatio mentalis, the expedient of a casuistic false politics, by virtue of which some Baroque warlords were accustomed to use even a peace treaty as an instrument for the waging of war by other means. I would like to conclude these reflections by referring to manifestations of the European awareness of cunning, as preserved in literature and works of art. We have recently gained a much better understanding of the literary archive of strategic thought, thanks to Peter von Matt's Die Intrige, Theorie und Praxis der Hinterlist, translation, Intrigue, Theory and Practice of Guile, which has been expanded into a virtual encyclopedia. This work, oriented towards historical motifs, exhaustively treats its subject matter with wonderful comprehensiveness and amazing erudition. If you would like, or are in need of, additional material in this vein, then you would have to look into the field of aesthetic theory, insofar as the artwork per se represents something that requires cunning theoretical commentary. In fact, numerous authors in the early modern era spoke of the arts in general, and of artworks in particular, as examples of the phenomenon of the welcome illusion. To the extent that the domains of art are freed from religious control, in order to affirm themselves as a dimension of autonomous fiction that expresses disinterested truth, a self-conscious demand for messages from the world of beautiful and entertaining semblance begins to take root. The stage is thus set for the centuries-long struggle between the marvellous, mirabile, and verisimilitude, verosimile, if we wish to update the customary translation of the maxim attributed to Sebastian Brandt, mundus vult decepi, translation, the world wants to be deceived. We would have to say, the world wants art, and wants it as a way to appreciate exciting illusions in which the impossible seems plausible, and the improbable certain. The deep alliance between the phenomenon of art and that of cunning, insofar as it is not to be found in the material itself, as is the case in adventure stories, crime stories, and the legends of Reynard the Fox, is based on the fact that artistic production is always also interested in the evocation of quote-unquote special effects that play with the audience's perceptual patterns and expectations, aside from its interest in traditional artistic conventions. Arts characteristically strive for the cunning of forms in order to produce effects that could not be achieved by content alone. The novelist Gerhard Schroeder has provided a fruitful direction for research into the hitherto little-regarded sphere of aesthetic forms as conveyors of strategic depths in his 1987 book Logos und List zur Entwicklung der Ästhetik in der frühen Neuzeit, Reason and Cunning, the development of aesthetics in the early modern era. We should not be surprised to encounter again Balthasar Gracian as one of the key figures in this text. I will conclude with a personal remark. Harro von Senger, whom I have to thank for suggesting that I entertain these thoughts, has noted in one of his publications on the phenomenon of cunning in the East and West that he would like to toss out a brick to attract jade, which corresponds to a 17th century Chinese stratagem. This has to do with his pointed thesis that Chinese thought is distinguished from European thought by a much more explicit awareness of cunning. In my preceding remarks, I have attempted to indicate just how nuanced this statement can be. In reality, Harro von Senger is too good a strategist not to also attempt a new version of the stratagem. It seems to me that he tossed out jade to prove by means of the brick that he received in return that we Western intellectuals and philosophers, if I may speak with such unseemly inclusiveness, have more to learn from Chinese wisdom and its interpreters, or sinologists, than we previously have imagined. Harro von Senger, who is very much concerned with the model of duping for the sake of the duped, which we have been discussing here, thus turns out to be an Enlightenment thinker in the best European tradition.